Kennedy looked directly at AOC in the Senate and said, "You don't understand real Americans." What happened next shocked everyone in the room and went viral in minutes. The Senate Judiciary Committee chamber buzzed with its usual mixture of political tension and procedural formality. Senators shuffled through prepared statements while staffers whispered urgently in corners, and reporters tapped away at laptops, half listening to what seemed like another routine hearing on economic policy. The mahogany-paneled room with its towering ceilings and formal portraits felt heavy with the weight of tradition and the familiar rhythm of Washington politics, but beneath the surface something was building. The hearing had been called to examine proposed legislation on minimum wage increases and worker protections, topics that always sparked heated debate. And today, two of the most compelling voices in American politics were about to collide in a way that would reshape the entire conversation. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat at the witness table, her burgundy blazer catching the camera lights as she reviewed her prepared testimony. She had been invited as a guest witness to discuss the real-world impact of economic policy on working families. Her presence alone had drawn additional media attention, with CNN and MSNBC positioning extra cameras to capture every moment. But what no one in that room expected was the verbal ambush that Senator John Kennedy was quietly preparing. Kennedy, the Louisiana Republican known for his folksy charm and sharp political instincts, had spent days crafting what he believed would be the perfect attack. In his mind, AOC represented everything wrong with modern progressive politics. A young politician who had risen too fast, who spoke about working-class struggles from the comfort of Washington's elite circles. He had no idea that his carefully planned assault was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. As AOC concluded her opening statement about the need for living wages, Kennedy leaned forward in his chair, his weathered hands gripping the microphone. The room sensed the shift, conversations quieted, and camera operators instinctively zoomed in, recognizing the telltale signs of a confrontation brewing. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez," Kennedy began, his distinctive Louisiana drawl carrying across the chamber with deceptive gentleness. "I've been listening to your testimony with great interest, and I have to say it sounds mighty fine from where you're sitting." AOC looked up from her notes, her dark eyes meeting Kennedy's with steady attention. She had learned to read the subtle warning signs in these hearings, and something in Kennedy's tone told her this wasn't going to be a standard policy discussion. "But here's what troubles me," Kennedy continued, his voice taking on an edge that made several senators glance up from their papers. "You come in here talking about working families and minimum wage jobs like you're some kind of expert on struggle. But the truth is, you don't understand real Americans." The words hit the chamber like a thunderclap. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Staffers froze with papers halfway to filing cabinets. Even the usually jaded reporters looked up from their screens, recognizing that Kennedy had just crossed a line from policy critique into personal attack. But Kennedy wasn't finished. He had rehearsed this moment, believing he was delivering a knockout blow that would expose what he saw as AOC's fundamental disconnect from the people she claimed to represent. "You've been in Washington for years now," he said, his voice rising slightly with what sounded like righteous indignation. "Living in your fancy apartments, going to your elite fundraisers, rubbing shoulders with Hollywood celebrities and tech billionaires. When's the last time you actually worked a real job? When's the last time you worried about making rent or choosing between groceries and gas money?" The attack was calculated, designed to paint AOC as another out-of-touch politician who had forgotten her roots. Kennedy leaned back in his chair with visible satisfaction, clearly believing he had landed a devastating blow that would reduce AOC to defensive stammering. What he didn't know was that he had just walked directly into the one fight that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been preparing for her entire life. The chamber fell into an expectant silence, all eyes turning to AOC to see how she would respond to such a direct and personal attack on her credibility. Camera lenses focused tightly on her face, waiting to capture the moment of defensive anger or flustered confusion that Kennedy obviously expected. But AOC didn't look flustered. Instead, a subtle smile played at the corners of her mouth, not smug or dismissive, but knowing, as if Kennedy had just asked her to discuss her favorite subject. She set down her pen with deliberate care, folded her hands in front of her, and looked directly at Kennedy with the kind of steady gaze that had made her famous in countless committee hearings. "Senator Kennedy," she began, her voice carrying a warmth that somehow made the formal chamber feel smaller and more intimate. "I appreciate you asking about my experience with real Americans and real work. It's actually something I think about every single day." She paused, and in that brief moment something shifted in the room's energy. The aggressive tension that Kennedy had created was transforming into something else, anticipation mixed with curiosity. "You asked when I last worked a real job," AOC continued, her tone remaining respectful but gaining strength. "Well, Senator, I was working 2 jobs, bartending and waitressing, right up until I ran for Congress. Not years ago, not as a college student but as an adult trying to make ends meet in one of the most expensive cities in America." Kennedy's confident expression began to waver slightly, but AOC was just getting started. But what AOC said next would completely change the trajectory of the hearing and create a viral moment that would be discussed for months. She reached into her portfolio and withdrew a small worn notebook, the kind service workers use to take orders and track tips. The simple gesture was so unexpected, so authentic that the entire chamber seemed to lean forward collectively. "This was my order pad from Flat's Fix, the taco shop in the Bronx where I worked," she said, holding it up for the room to see. "I kept it because it reminds me of something important, that the people we serve in Congress aren't abstract concepts or voting demographics. They're real people with real names and real stories." She opened the notebook, its pages yellowed and filled with her handwriting from years of taking food orders, and began to read. "Maria, table 6, always ordered the veggie burrito but could only afford it twice a week because she was sending money to her mother in Ecuador. James, the construction worker who came in every Tuesday, always left a $5 tip even though I could tell he was counting every penny because his daughter needed school supplies." The room was absolutely silent now, transfixed by the unexpected intimacy of her response. This wasn't the polished political rhetoric anyone had expected. It was something completely different. "These weren't just customers, Senator Kennedy," AOC continued, her voice carrying a deep personal conviction. "They were my neighbors, my community, and when they told me their stories about working 2 jobs and still not being able to afford health care, about choosing between fixing their car or paying rent, I wasn't hearing talking points, I was hearing my own life." She looked directly at Kennedy, her expression remaining respectful but unwavering. "You want to know about choosing between groceries and gas money? I did that math every week for years. You want to know about worrying about rent? I lived in a studio apartment in the Bronx where the heat barely worked in winter because it was what I could afford on a bartender's salary. But the most powerful moment was yet to come, and when it arrived it would leave Kennedy completely speechless." AOC set her notebook on the table and leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a tone that was both personal and profound. "But here's what I learned from those years, Senator, and it's something that shaped every piece of legislation I've ever supported. Dignity isn't determined by the size of your paycheck. The single mother working at McDonald's to support her kids, she's not looking for charity, she's looking for a fair wage for honest work. The man cleaning office buildings at night so he can take care of his disabled father during the day, he doesn't want handouts, he wants health care that doesn't bankrupt his family." She paused, and in that silence, the weight of her words settled over the chamber like a blanket. "I didn't leave the working class when I came to Congress, Senator Kennedy. I brought them with me." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Several senators nodded unconsciously, their expressions reflecting a mix of surprise and respect. In the gallery, a group of young staff members began to applaud, the sound growing as others joined in. Even some of Kennedy's usual allies seemed moved by the authenticity of AOC's response. Kennedy himself sat in stunned silence, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The attack he had planned so carefully had not only failed, it had backfired in the most spectacular way possible, revealing not AOC's disconnect from working Americans, but his own assumptions about her background. But AOC wasn't finished. She had one more card to play that would seal Kennedy's fate and create a moment that political commentators would analyze for years to come. Reaching into her portfolio again, she pulled out a folder filled with letters, not official correspondence, but handwritten notes on everything from napkins to the backs of receipts. "These are letters from the people I worked with, Senator," she said, her voice now carrying the confidence of someone who knew she was winning. "Letters from the dishwashers and line cooks and servers who trusted me with their stories because they knew I understood their struggles." She opened the folder and selected one particular letter, its edges worn from handling. "This is from Carmen, who worked in the kitchen at Flat's Fix. She wrote this after I won my primary, and I want to share part of it with you." AOC's voice grew slightly emotional as she read, "Misha, you did it. You really did it." All those nights we talked about how nobody in Washington understands what it's like to count tips to pay rent, to work doubles just to keep your head above water. Now we have someone who knows. Don't ever forget us, okay? We believe in you." The room fell completely silent when she finished reading, and several people in the gallery were visibly emotional. The power of Carmen's words, combined with AOC's authentic delivery, created a moment of genuine human connection that transcended political party lines. Kennedy looked as though he wanted to disappear into his chair. His calculated attack had been completely dismantled, not by political rhetoric or defensive anger, but by simple, honest truth. The young congresswoman he had tried to dismiss as an out-of-touch elite had just demonstrated a depth of working-class credibility that he couldn't match. But the most shocking moment was still to come, and it would involve Kennedy himself doing something that stunned everyone in the chamber. After a long moment of silence, Kennedy cleared his throat and did something that was almost unprecedented in the hostile environment of modern politics. He publicly acknowledged his mistake. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez," he said, his voice notably quieter than before, "I want to apologize. I made assumptions about your background and experience that were clearly wrong, and that wasn't fair to you or to this process." The admission sent shockwaves through the chamber. Senators exchanged glances of disbelief. Staffers stopped what they were doing to stare. This kind of public acknowledgement of error was so rare in Washington that it felt almost surreal. Kennedy continued, his humility appearing genuine. "Your response has given me a lot to think about regarding how we discuss these issues and how we treat each other in this process. I respect your experience and your advocacy for working families." The moment was captured by every camera in the room, and within minutes, clips of the exchange were racing across social media platforms. The hashtag AOC response began trending immediately, with thousands of users sharing and commenting on her powerful testimony. But the impact went far beyond social media likes and shares. Within hours, major news outlets were running the story as their lead item. Cable news networks interrupted regular programming to discuss the exchange, with commentators calling it a masterclass in authentic political communication and a reminder of why personal experience matters in policymaking. The letters AOC had shared resonated particularly strongly with viewers. Social media was flooded with people sharing their own stories of working-class struggle, using the hashtag Carmen was right to honor the kitchen worker whose letter had moved so many people. Even conservative commentators, typically critical of AOC, found themselves praising her response. One prominent Republican strategist tweeted, "I disagree with most of AOC's policies, but that was genuine leadership." She turned a personal attack into a powerful reminder of why representation matters. The viral moment had a lasting impact on both politicians involved. For AOC, it solidified her reputation as an authentic voice for working families, and demonstrated her ability to handle attacks with grace and strength. The video of her response became one of the most watched political clips of the year, shared millions of times across platforms. For Kennedy, the exchange became a learning moment that seemed to genuinely change his approach to political discourse. In subsequent hearings, he was notably more respectful in his questioning of witnesses, and he later co-sponsored legislation with AOC aimed at supporting service workers. But perhaps the most important impact was on the broader political conversation. AOC's response reminded everyone watching that behind every policy debate are real people with real stories, and that authentic experience matters in creating effective solutions. The letters from Carmen and other service workers that AOC had shared became symbols of a different kind of political discourse, one grounded in human experience rather than partisan talking points. News outlets followed up with interviews of several of the letter writers, giving voice to working Americans who rarely have platforms to share their stories. Carmen herself, the kitchen worker whose letter had moved so many people, was interviewed by a local Bronx television station. "Alexandria never forgot where she came from," she said, tears in her eyes. "She's still the same person who used to listen to our problems during our breaks. Now she just has a bigger platform to do something about them." The exchange also had practical policy implications. The minimum wage legislation that had originally prompted the hearing gained new momentum, with several senators citing AOC's testimony as influential in their decision to support it. The bill ultimately passed with bipartisan support, a rare achievement in an increasingly polarized political environment. Educational institutions began using clips of AOC's response in courses on political communication and public speaking, highlighting how authentic personal experience can be more powerful than polished rhetoric.
Leadership programs pointed to the exchange as an example of how to handle criticism with dignity and turn attacks into opportunities for meaningful dialogue. The moment also sparked broader conversations about class and representation in American politics. Opinion pieces in major newspapers examined how working-class voices are often marginalized in political discourse, and how AOC's background provided her with insights that more traditional political career paths might not offer. Years later, political historians would point to this exchange as a defining moment in AOC's career, the day she proved that her working-class credentials weren't just campaign talking points, but genuine experiences that shaped her approach to governance. For Kennedy, the moment became part of his own evolution as a politician. He later spoke publicly about how AOC's response had challenged his assumptions and reminded him of the importance of listening before judging. The two would go on to work together on several pieces of legislation. Their relationship transformed from antagonistic to respectful collaboration. The Senate hearing that day had begun as a routine discussion of economic policy, but AOC's response to Kennedy's attack transformed it into something much more significant, a reminder that the most powerful political moments often come not from careful strategizing or clever soundbites, but from simple human truth. In the end, Kennedy's attempt to portray AOC as out of touch had backfired completely, revealing instead the depth of her connection to the working Americans she represented. Her order pad, her letters from colleagues, and her authentic emotional response had cut through the typical political noise to create a moment of genuine impact. The lesson was clear. In an era of manufactured political personas and focus group-tested messaging, authenticity remains the most powerful force in public discourse. AOC's response proved that sometimes the best way to handle an attack is not with a counterattack, but with truth, simple, honest, and powerfully delivered. And that truth, captured in a moment of vulnerability and strength, would resonate far beyond the marble halls of the Senate, inspiring countless Americans who saw their own struggles reflected in the words of a young congresswoman who had never forgotten where she came from.